Hello, everybody. Thank you so much for joining us. If you are wondering where you are at the book talk or the Don't Label Me event, the culmination of the book talk, or the book conversations, I should say, of the book Don't Label Me with our wonderful author, Irshad Manji. And I will do a quick introduction in a little bit, but I do want to say and let you all know that if you are joining us on YouTube via our live stream, please feel free to drop your questions on to the chat, and we will get those questions over to us. If you are a high school student or a college student joining us, please let us know. We would love to move your questions up and kind of make them a priority, as always at the Conference of World Affairs. And if you are joining us via Zoom, welcome. You can also drop your questions via the Q&A button at the bottom. But without further ado, I would like to introduce Irshad Manji. Irshad is the founder of Moral Courage College, which teaches people how to engage about polarizing issues without shaming or canceling each other. A professor of leadership at New York University for many years, she now lectures with Oxford University's Initiatives for Global Ethics and Human Rights. Her books are bestsellers in some countries and are banned in others. As a result, Oprah has given Irshad the Chutzpah Award for boldness. Irshad's latest book, Don't Label Me, redefines diversity to include differences of thought and opinion. Chris Rock calls this the definition of genius. Not everyone agrees. So with that, thank you for joining us, Irshad, and welcome.
I'm so pleased. I'm so pleased to be here, Beatrice, and thank you for moderating, and thank you CWA for hosting. It's my first time actually involved with the Conference on World Affairs, and I hope it won't be the last. But that'll depend as much on you, i.e., whether I'm re-invited, as it will be on me. Hey, everybody. So let me just take a few minutes to give a little bit of my own background. You gave some of the resume points, I guess we could call them, Beatrice, and I'll just give you a sense of what makes me passionate about issues related to not just diversity, inclusion, pluralism, but also issues about how we communicate across lines of difference and disagreement. For me, after all, diversity is cosmetic, is superficial if it does not include diversity of viewpoint, which is why one of the things I need to say right off the top is whoever has questions that challenge my point of view, I welcome that. I have something to learn and not just something to teach. So please know that the only way you'll be offending me is by self-censoring. With that in mind, I'll tell you a bit of my own backstory. My family and I are refugees from a small country in East Africa, Uganda. We were booted out by a military dictator named Idi Amin. And this was for us in 1972. And hundreds of thousands of brown-skinned families were booted out. Interestingly enough, because we weren't Black. Idi Amin had declared Africa belonged only to Blacks, which meant that we had to flee on pain of execution. And we wound up in Canada. Now that's a pretty good place to wind up as a refugee, I will be the first to say. I like to joke, by the way, that the government at the time was just so open to having new citizens that they gave us our parkas when we arrived, because after all, Canada can be cold, particularly in October, and which is when we arrived. And the joke is that we got both peace and fleece at the same time. So anyway, I grew up on the west coast of Canada, and there I went to two kinds of schools: the regular secular public school of most North American kids. And then on top of that, every Saturday for several hours at a stretch, the Islamic religious school. And I'm a pretty curious individual by nature. So I started asking what I thought were, simple questions. And simple they may have been, but they were also highly inconvenient. And at the ripe old age of 14, after asking one too many of these inconvenient questions, I was ordered by my madrasa teacher to either believe or get out. And if you get out, he said, get out for good. Now, I remember thinking at the time, get out for good? There is a God. But I quickly realized that I would have a lot of explaining to do once I got home. So I took the long way home that afternoon, thinking, what am I going to say to my mother? So I get home and she has already received the phone call. Now, to her credit, she was just too busy, working class mom, just too busy to debate the finer points or any points of theology with me. And she said to me, okay, Irshad, I know that you have a lot of questions about everything. And I'm not going to demand that you go back to the madrasa and ask for forgiveness. I know you don't think you've done anything that requires forgiveness. Asking questions is okay. So all I ask of you now is one thing. Since you're no longer allowed to be at the madrasa every Saturday, what are you going to do with all that time? I want you to be thoughtful about it, she said. And I was blown away. First of all, I didn't get yelled at. That is awesome. But also I was blown away because my mother showed faith in my ability to think for myself. And because she had expectations of me, I wanted to live up to those expectations. So it's no surprise that I wound up not at the arcade or at the roller rink as we had back then, but at the public library, where I devoured everything I could about my religion and other religions, cultures and belief systems. And that is when I discovered something that I simply would not have learned at the madrasa, something positive about my faith, which is that Islam has its own tradition of independent thinking and debate and dissent and even reinterpretation. And in so many ways, what happened at the public library and what got me there, namely my mother's faith and my ability to think and to think responsibly, set me on a course to appreciate that all of us have the capacity to think responsibly. But too often, we don't give each other that kind of credit. We bully and we mock and we shame and we humiliate other people into taking our point of view. When in reality, especially around identity issues, we could be expressing ourselves in a way that actually makes people want to listen. And really, that's why I wrote Don't Label Me. The subtitle of the book is as important as the main title. The subtitle is How to Do Diversity Without Inflaming the Culture Wars. Notice, my mom got what she wanted. I remained Muslim and I got even deeper into my faith because I discovered something so positive about Islam. She got what she wanted, not by shoving disagreement with me in my face, but actually telling me that she expected good things and that as a result, she was going to give me the freedom to explore. And I never felt, as a result, put down or demeaned. Whereas my madrasa teacher did not get what he wanted, right? He gave me the ultimatum, either you believe or you get out. Well, I got out, but I also wrote a book, my very first book, about the need for reform in my faith of Islam. And by the way, not just because of that experience. That's what set me on the course to want to learn more. But the point being, his way of communicating, the ultimatum, the finger wagging, the shaming, blew up in his face. Whereas my mother's way of communicating, engaging and engaging sincerely, actually delivered for her what she wanted to see from me. And I wonder if we took that approach to talking with one another about really emotional yes, polarizing issues like identity, both individual and national, wouldn't we get further than by mocking and ridiculing and scorning one another? And so Don't Label Me is as much about how to reconcile and heal the divide in these United States as it is about the controversial issues, whether it's free speech, whether it's social justice, whether it's MAGA, whether it's Black Lives Matter. It's as much about the how of engaging one another as it is about what we believe. And with that in mind, I will turn it back to you.
Thank you. That was really insightful. And I really appreciate kind of the background information and that background piece of like your mom in some way really inspired you to become who you are, as cliche as it sounds, but it was like, I'm going to hold these expectations. I'm going to set the bar high and you're going to meet them. And then it gave you the opportunity to meet them in a way that felt true and right for you.
Exactly. You said it far better than I could, Beatrice. That's exactly right. And can I just say that this wasn't, a fluke. In fact, what I've done in researching Don't Label Me is I've read a lot of literature around neuroscience, so brain science, and social psychology, which is the psychology of why groups of people do what we do. And therefore, why, for example, we are, at least we feel as divided or as polarized as we feel today. And it turns out that there is one non-negotiable, ironclad law of human psychology. And if you remember only this from tonight, folks, remember this, that if you wish to be heard, the most reliable way is to go first in the listening department. Because what happens when you actually listen to somebody who you disagree with or disagrees with you is that you give them a reason to believe that you actually care about where they're coming from. And what that does then is it lowers emotional defenses on their side, so that as they see that you respect them enough to engage rather than dismiss or label them, the clutter and clatter in their own heads, the kind of ego-based noise that says, don't let Irshad Manji win. No, you've got to slap her down. You cannot show any weakness. That's the ego talking. And the ego is something we all have. It's part of the primitive part of our brain. But when you lower the emotional defenses of the person who disagrees with you or you disagree with, that noise more or less vanishes. And now they can truly listen to where you are coming from. So in fact, Beatrice, this way of engaging is not about being nice. It's not even about being civil for the sake of civility. Much harm has been done to large populations in the name of civility. So that's not where I'm coming from. I'm coming from a place of wanting all of us to be better communicators of what we believe. And what I'm trying to show in Don't Label Me is that you can stand your ground and at the same time seek common ground. If that sounds like a contradiction, I'll quickly unpack it. Standing your ground is about what you believe. Seeking common ground is about how you express what you believe. And if you express what you believe in a way that leaves the other, your other, feeling respected, not agreed with, but respected, you are far more likely to have them thinking about where you're coming from than turning you away.
Yeah. So it sounds like you're saying that in order to be heard, we first have to hear.
That's exactly right. And incidentally, this is not a new idea. I love one of the philosophers I draw from a lot in Don't Label Me is Bruce Lee. Of course, you know the name, martial arts master, right? But it turns out he was also a great philosopher, and he studied Taoism, which is an Eastern philosophy. And as a result, he taught his own students. Now, remember, they're entering into something of a competition with their opponents, right? Because this is martial arts. But he taught his own students first, bow to your opponent. Second, be like water. And what he meant was water always gets to where it needs to go, but not merely by crashing up against the obstacles in its midst. Water also glides around the obstacles, seeps through the obstacles, and washes over the obstacles. And if you're like water, you're not going to be, rigid. You're not going to be dogmatic. You're going to be open to changing current. And in that way, you're also going to be unpredictable. So you're actually in a position now to engage genuinely with your other, rather than simply sticking to your talking points. And he pointed out that it's when you're like water that your opponent won't really be able to predict where you're coming from, which is why, in fact, you'll wind up having more power in the conversation, but also you have a responsibility to use it well. So this is, again, not about compromising or about, giving the other more power than they deserve. It's really about claiming your power, even when you have many labels that suggest your marginalization. Look at me, Muslim, woman, person of color, queer. That's a lot of intersectionality right there, right? And yet, here I am speaking to you and with many others as a thought leader. The point is that you're so much better of a teacher when you're willing to learn as well.
Yeah. Well, we actually had a first question come in, if that's okay.
Of course.
John wants to know why or how is this any of this controversial?
I don't think it is controversial, John, and it certainly shouldn't be. But I think the reason that some people take offense at what I'm arguing is that I've learned over the years and in my own research that a lot of us are so stuck in one place and have defined that place as our identity that anytime you're asked to even just hear where somebody who disagrees with you is coming from, it feels like you're being asked to give up your identity. And in part, there's a biological reason for this, John. I mentioned that we all have a primitive part of the brain, and that is where the ego resides. Now, you may know the word ego, but if you've heard about it, you've probably heard about it in like a mystical way or a self-helpy way. But I'm talking about ego as a function of the brain, and the ego's main job, in fact, its only job, is to keep us alive. So, our hunter-gatherer ancestors, 70,000 years ago, they heard a rustle in the bush. The ego kicked in and said to them, hold on, either you fight, you freeze, or you flee, because that rustle in the bush could be something waiting to attack you, right? We have not lost that part of us, but the problem with the ego is that it cannot distinguish between mortal danger and mere discomfort. So when we're being disagreed with, as an example, all we're feeling is discomfort. It's not an attack on our humanity or an existential threat, but the ego wants you to be prepared to fight. And many of us, therefore, fall for that, frankly, manipulation. Instead, what I'm suggesting in the book is that there are ways that we can become much more aware of what we're feeling in a moment of tension or division. And the first thing we need to do is just breathe deeply. so that we can slow down the blood rush in the body and allow ourselves to travel from the primitive part of the brain to the more executive part of the brain, where reason and emotion can coexist. And so, again, back to your question, John. Great, but why is this controversial? Well, because I'm asking people to do some inner work, to recognize that sometimes the way other people respond or react to them is as much a doing about, is as much the result of what they've done, making the other defensive by labeling them. For example, you are evil, you are, you're insidious, you're ignorant for taking the position that you do. And if you're told in turn, well, if that's your version of social justice, count me out, because to me, name calling is not justice. It's not always that we get this kind of response because people are bigoted. It's sometimes because of the way we communicate. And a lot of people don't want to hear that. But I say it, John, and I'll finish up with this. I say it because I believe in diversity. And I believe in it so much that I don't mind being on the receiving end of backlash if I can teach activists, among whom I'm one, to communicate in ways that seek common ground, that find commonality before we dive into our differences. But it takes work. And again, not everybody wants to do the work, so it's easier to point fingers than it is to challenge oneself, to dig deeper and engage in introspection.
That's really powerful, because you're asking us to think about our automatic responses,
right?
And allow, I guess, more calling like that prefrontal cortex into play, and kind of.
And the prefrontal cortex, because we won't get into the weeds here scientifically, but what Beatrice has just articulated, the prefrontal cortex is the more evolved part of our brain. And so, in a way, Beatrice, we're actually in a game with ourselves. And I actually would love it if people would, play that game with themselves, right? That when they are finding themselves in a moment of, high emotion, and it's obvious that it's not a life or death situation, will they outwit their own brains by taking that deep breath and by seeking the commonality before diving into difference? If you're willing to do that and turn it into a habit so that it literally becomes a no-brainer, you have just outwitted, I should say, a 70,000-year-old part of the brain that we're all born with. And that's the opportunity that we have.
Yeah. Well, speaking of kind of engaging, we have a question from a non-traditional college student.
Great.
So they are saying that they have noticed that many people who lean liberal object to some of this because they fear it will result in throwing marginalized people under the bus and silencing them. They object to the idea of listening to racist, sexist, homophobes, etc. How do you respond to that objection?
Sure. So first thing is that I would ask such people, what do they define as racism, sexism, homophobia, et cetera? And I'll give you just a quick example. A lot of people, regardless of the color of their skin, regardless of their background, have questions. And we have questions for one another. But a lot of people are self-censoring today because they fear that a question that they ask may be labeled as racist. And obviously, nobody within, who is in a conversation in good faith wants to be called racist. right? People who are just there as trolls or there to egg on, they don't mind that. In fact, they want you to do that because they want to get the better of you. But people who are in it in good faith, that's the last thing they want, is to be called racist. So we've got to be really clear that we need to be giving people the grace to ask questions that may come off in a clumsy or awkward way. It doesn't mean that they are racist. And then I would say, let me give you an example of a situation in which one of my own students found herself. And I think it'll, be a great lesson for how we can actually communicate in ways that are productive around issues of racism and other forms of discrimination. So Genesis is her name. She was a student of mine at NYU, where I was teaching, and she's a hip hop artist, born in the South. And one day in New York City, at a concert, a hip hop concert, she waved the Confederate battle flag, and she tied a noose around her neck. And she announced that Mississippi, her home state, had just named April Confederate Heritage Month. And she threw the Confederate battle flag into the audience and suggested that people rip it up. And she had that noose around her neck still. Needless to say, photos were taken, they went viral, and what comes next? The death threats, of course. So as Genesis was scrolling through her social feeds, she was just pummeled with hate, right? But something she noticed 25 years ago, when she was like 4 years old, she remembered this kid named Lewis who lived in her neighborhood. And Lewis was writing to her on Facebook saying, look, you shouldn't die for what you believe, but boy, do I ever disagree with you about the flag. She could have labeled him a racist and walked away and never thought about him again. But she decided to take a different approach. She invited Lewis to her backyard in Mississippi, where the two of them sat down over lemonade, and they talked. They hashed out the issue. And she said to Lewis, the first thing she said to him was not a statement, but a question, and a really sincere one. She said, Lewis, how does the Mississippi state flag, which includes the Confederate battle emblem, how does that make you feel? And he replied, it makes me feel like I'm home. And because she asked him a heartfelt question, one that he didn't have to strain his brain to respond to, he felt the moral obligation to ask her, how does it make you feel? And she said, it makes me feel unwelcome, even though I too am at home. And the conversation got underway in earnest. And here's what Lewis realized during the conversation. He actually realized that he cared more about Genesis than he did about the flag itself. So afterwards, I asked him, why? What happened? And he said, I've never gotten that kind of respect from somebody on the other side. And what he meant by respect was not that he was agreed with, because he wasn't. He meant that somebody took the time to ask me where I'm coming from. And in fact, questioner, that is the definition of respect. It comes from the Latin word respectate. Spectate means look, re means again. So look again. Don't take the first impression as the last impression. Ask questions, dig deeper, engage. And because that's what Genesis did for him and with him, months later, Lewis, without anybody asking him to, after thinking about everything that Genesis had said to him, actually pulled down the Confederate battle flag flying in his backyard. He folded it up and he put it in a box called Things of the Past. And he joined the movement to replace the Mississippi state flag, which, by the way, the movement won just 5 months ago. I'm not saying that every conversation will go this swimmingly, not at all. But imagine that, Genesis would have been leaving change on the table if she prematurely walked away. And please remember, prejudgment is what leads to the word prejudice. And we're all capable of it. So if we want to live up to the ideals that we claim we have as liberals and progressives, sometimes, in fact, often, it's wise to role model those ideals by going first in the listening department.
I feel like that's a really good segue into a couple of questions that we've received. So I'll kind of combine them.
Okay.
One of them is saying, I love your point about standing your ground, but being able to hear. Listening is so critical. I find myself saying we have to agree to disagree on this when I'm talking about certain issues. Do you think that that is a good phrase, or is there a better way to conclude a conversation that two cannot see eye to eye or cannot agree? And then actually somebody from our book group also asked and mentioned, Dr. Eddie Moore says some pancakes can't be flipped, i.e. people. And people find this to be true.
Yeah. What do I say to that? Right. So remind me, Beatrice, to answer the first question, okay? But I'm going to answer the second one first because I think it'll lead into the first question. Absolutely. Some people can't be flipped, and you might be one of them. It's not just your other who might not be flippable. You might not be flippable by the other, right? Here's the point. We don't go into these conversations to change minds. We really don't. You know what we go into these conversations to do? First and foremost, to humanize ourselves and all of those other people who have the position that we do. You might have thought I was going to say to humanize the other. That is a side, reward of it. But the beauty is that when you enter into conversations, willing to listen and learn from your other, what they realize is, wow, not only do you not have horns growing out of your head, but they're going to remember that when they encounter other people who also have your position, that if you were willing to spend the kind of time with them to listen to why they believe what they believe, and they can't dehumanize you, because now you're human to them, they can't dehumanize these other people, either. Again, that's the beauty of the way our biology works, right? Somebody has to go first in the listening department. Why shouldn't it be you? And by the way, you will always learn something. I'll tell you what you will always learn. You'll learn what the values of your other are. And that, with that information, down the road, you can reframe your own arguments in a way that takes those values into account. And now those arguments have finally a shot at being heard. Whereas previously they wouldn't have, because you're just operating and arguing from your own perspective without taking into account where others, stand and why they stand there, right? So this leads me, I don't need the reminder, this is good. This leads me to the first question. Should we simply say, let's agree to disagree? Or is there a better way of ending the conversation? I think there is a better way. And that is to say, thank you so much for your time. Because they don't have to spend their precious time engaged with you. They could also walk off. But what they have just done is given you the gift, not just of their time, but also of information. And it's information, again, that you can use to re-articulate why you believe what you believe in a way that your other can hear, if not in this conversation, then in the next one. And it'll also teach you something about yourself. Why do I think the way I do? let me clarify that. Because if I can't even clarify that for me, how am I going to clarify that for anybody else? Right? So even if you really do want to change, hi, Kat, even if you really do want to change the other's mind, you'll now have the information with which to couch your own argument. But please, don't think of this as a debate. The moment you think of it as somebody has to win and somebody has to lose, both of your egos will flare, because your egos will be saying, don't let the other win. And that means the noise starts up again and listening goes out the window. Not every discussion has to be a debate.
So I guess with that, this is a question from the audience, how does the quote unquote slave dialogue with the quote unquote master, or in other words, how do the marginalized listen to and dialogue with the king, i.e. the oppressed?
So those are inflammatory words that are used, the slave and the master. And I'm going to ask the person who asked that question, do you really believe that we are in a situation, at least in this part of the world, where any one of us is enslaved to the other? Now, I know that there are situations in which, for example, working class people, are have no choice but to work the hours that their employers demand. My mother was one of them, right? But remember, the fact that, for example, she was working class did not stop her from also using her power to engage with me in a way that made her a role model for how to live. Let me ask you this, questioner. You might be a slave, or somebody you know might be a slave to another person. But if you allow yourself to fall into the trap of believing that makes them only a victim, exclusively a victim, then you might be a slave to the ego that tells you, don't rethink your position. Because if you did rethink, then you'd have to ask yourself all kinds of questions about why you believe what you believe. And that might mean that you have to question your own identity. And if you question your identity, well, then who will you be now? And that's a lot of work, right? So remember, being enslaved is not just about the external powers that be. It's also about the power that you allow your ego to have over you. Liberate yourself.
I'm curious to hear how systemic and systems of oppression would come into this as you're kind of dialoguing and going through this question. Because that's something that's coming up for me. There's this certain piece of, right, like certain, it's certain folks are certain communities are consistently targeted or left out of the conversation intentionally.
Right.
Or, I'm thinking about
or historically,
or even thinking about, the conversations in Georgia right now around voting rights and who has the right to vote.
Right.
I'm also curious how that might also come into play with, like, we might not, there's still those levels of oppression. There's still those systems that continue to and marginalize and other.
Absolutely. And I acknowledge in Don't Label Me, more than acknowledge, I talk about the fact that systemic discrimination exists. I've been on the receiving end of it myself. And sometimes you're absolutely right if you're thinking, we pour into the streets. We've got to pour into the streets and protest, clench our fists and punch them in the air and demand change. And anything I say tonight does not mean that you should, get rid of protest as an approach. Diversity includes diversity of approach, diversity of strategies. All I'm saying is Don't assume that the first move you have to make is to demand. Now, let me give you right to the question of systemic discrimination. One of the things I've learned, even as I have, traveled around the world, Beatrice, advocating reform in my faith of Islam, I've learned that, like religions, institutions, systems, and structures do not speak for themselves. It is those who inhabit those institutions, structures, and systems who speak on their behalf. Because these things, institutions, systems, structures, are not sentient beings. They do not make decisions on their own. We, who are part of them, make the decisions, right? Which is why it still comes back to people. And that's why it also still comes back to whether we're developing relationships with the people whom we believe need to make different decisions. Here's an example. Nobody on this call today, I hope, can disagree with the policy of desegregating public schools in the US. But the way that policy was implemented created yet more injustices. Think about it. We had Black schools and we had white schools. And what happened? In the desegregation process, Black kids were bused to white schools. Well, of course they were, some would say. I mean, the white schools had the resources. But wait, I say, why didn't policymakers understand that uprooting Black children from an environment that they knew and really sort of cutting them off from Black school teachers, about half of whom lost their jobs in the process, why wouldn't that have occurred to policymakers, and therefore had some white students bused to Black schools and shifted resources to Black schools so that there's more of a balance in the burden that both white and Black people, took on? And I've engaged with a number of educational historians about this. And the more I've asked, the more it came down to one point. Policymakers would have never thought about Black people as actual human beings. For example, teachers, Black teachers, as actual professionals with credentials and with the need to feed their own families. They wouldn't have thought of children as little people, little adults who also feel, the toll of being ripped out of their environments. No, what they saw were Black people as a grand abstraction, as a political problem. And the point is this, that had these policymakers developed relationships with Black people in their own lives, they would have understood that we don't stop being individuals even as we are members of certain groups, that we don't stop having deeply human needs even as we pass sweeping legislation. So without those relationships, a sweeping a piece of legislation created new injustices in order to solve old ones. This is why relationships matter. And transformation happens in relationship, not when we think of one another as mere labels or as abstracts.
I guess that also might be a good segue to one of the questions that was posed is, the US is segregated by race and class, so conversations often happen in segregated bubbles. A lot of these conversations appear to be intellectual without diversity in the room. How do people seek out diversity to learn from?
It is an effort. It really does take an effort. And it has to be intentional, right? Because again, think about the brain. The brain is a pattern-seeking organ. We will naturally drift to the people we know, the people who are, quote, like us. And that's not a knock on white people or people of color or people with abilities, disabilities, or queer people, we all do it because that's how we're wired. And this is why we've got to be intentional about seeking out those whom we don't know. That means learning the skills, for example, as a high school student, to not today, sit down, well, post-pandemic, I'll say this, to sit down at the same, lunch table in the cafeteria as your clique, but to actually stand up, walk over to another table, sit down and say, hey, I'm Irshad. I don't know you guys. You don't know me. But, I figured it's time that we got to know one another because, listen, we're part of the same school. But don't let me interrupt. If you don't mind, I'll just kind of, insinuate myself into the conversation when the time is right. Now, you're going to be looked at really weird. You might even be laughed at. And that's okay. Because I guarantee you, all that people are laughing about is that you have the guts to do this. And they can't imagine themselves doing the same. But there will always be at least one person at that table who comes up to you afterwards to say, that was really cool, man. Thanks. Oh, I'm, so-and-so. So make an effort. Don't wait for other people. If you think that white people have all the power, don't wait for a white person to, walk over or if they're in a wheelchair, roll over and say, I'm so-and-so. You do it. You're not giving up any power. You might think, of course I'm not, because I don't have any. Not true. You're actually claiming your power to create the culture of the conversation that you're about to have.
That's really interesting. And it kind of reminds me to one of the questions that was posed by our book study group, which says that you recommend that educators not sponsor affinity groups or identity groups that subdivide people into races. Are there times when being grouped with folks with a similar identity and life experience could enhance open conversations and create a sense of safety?
Yes. Yes, I think, I'm sorry, you were going to say.
And when it might not be okay for somebody to step into that space.
Sure. Yep, I do think that affinity groups can be constructive, but there's a caveat to that. There's a qualifier here. As a teacher and a professor myself, I've seen many, many cases in which affinity group discussions become, and I'm going to use a word here, and I apologize for anybody with delicate ears, when they become basically bitch sessions, okay? When people, unsupervised, just start to talk about those other people. Oh, I'm so glad I'm not, I'm with you guys and not those other people. Did you hear what so-and-so said? Did you see what so-and-so did? And here's the thing. When we lapse into that kind of tribal mentality, where we're literally playing an us versus them game, we don't allow for room to hear different points of view within the affinity group. Because now we have set ourselves up as us and those other people as them. And it means that the pressure is on for anybody within that group who has a different perspective. The pressure is on for them to clam up and conform. Because if I say, hey, wait a minute, I'm going to defend the person you're talking about, suddenly, are they really us or are they them? Right? So if we're going to have affinity groups, we have to be, I think, attentive to the fact that it's easy to develop what they call in psychology group think, where we're just going with the flow in the group instead of actively allowing for different points of view within the group to be heard. If that can happen, if we're willing to make the effort to allow for diversity of viewpoint, even as we identify with a particular trait, then I think, yes, affinity groups can be constructive. At the very least, they can't be harmful. But again, we have to be intentional then about how we lead them.
Yeah, I was thinking about, as you were talking, thinking about my own experience and how the affinity groups were so crucial to my development, because it was coming in and having a shared experience about what I was going through, and having a space to share my experience in a way that was like, oh, you're gonna understand, right? Like, and there's some things I'm just not gonna have to explain to you. Um, and I think that there's power in that, right? Like when you're drained and you're emotionally tired, like there's power in that of just being like, I just want to be heard. And then there's the other side of like, how can I also learn to communicate this with other folks, right? So that I don't have to feel this again. So yeah.
I totally hear you on that, Beatrice. And obviously, you're not alone in needing that kind of a space in which your experiences will be simply understood. At the same time, though, if I'm part of the same affinity group, and I'm thinking to myself, but wait, what happened to you also happened to me, and I took it in a different way. I would think twice, or a lot more than twice, about whether I'm going to say something about that, because I now don't want to be the outcast. I don't want to be thought that I'm apologizing for what has happened, right? So it's absolutely understandable. And we don't have to create this us against them kind of paradigm. But because identity so often is defined as not being that, as opposed to being this, we fall into the trap of us versus them too easily. Yeah. So intentionality matters.
Yeah. I think we have time for about 2 more questions.
Okay.
If that's okay.
Yeah.
Let's see. Let me see if I can. Oh, this one was an interesting one that came from our book group. As we were reading, I forget which section
right.
we were in. But it was during right after all of the elections and all of the not after all the elections, after all of the Capitol raids. And then Twitter deplatformed, Twitter and Facebook deplatformed Trump.
Right.
And so one of the questions that our book club had for you was, do you believe Twitter and Facebook were right to deplatform Trump? What do you think of language being a weapon?
Yeah. Well, Trump uses language as a weapon. It's a shame. But he knows how to tap into the basest instincts that we human beings have. And all populists do, by the way. So part of me was, excited and thrilled when Twitter yanked him off the platform, and Facebook too, because to my mind, Trump abuses freedom of speech. And he knows that what he does really is like yelling fire in a crowded theater, because he has like this captive audience. And the US Supreme Court has pointed out that yelling fire in a crowded theater is unconstitutional. That is a limit to free speech. So that side of me was relieved. You know what side of me was not relieved, and that I still worry about and will worry about until proven wrong? I worry that by yanking those platforms, out of his hands, he will be able to claim that he's yet more of a martyr. And as a result, he's now got even more ammo with which to weaponize language, right? So look, for now, I am reveling in the fact that we can actually focus on our lives and on policy as people who live in the United States. I so do not miss the noise, can I tell you? That said, let's be really cognizant about, what more is taken away from people who identify with him. Because again, just like the desegregation policy was implemented in a way that was meant to solve injustice, yet created more injustices, it's important to ask yourself, though this move is meant to lower the temperature, could it actually wind up being a blessing for the people who want to rack up the temperature?
Yeah. Well, we're going to get to our last question. Before I put the last question out there were so many other questions that we did not get to. Yeah. There were some questions around cancel culture and your thoughts on that, as well as, why can't we embrace this conversation as a debate? But I wanted to save this last question because this event today is part of, it was put up on behalf of the Racism in the United States Committee for the Conference on World Affairs.
Okay.
And one of the things that we hope to do and ask folks to do is, if you come or attend any of our events, whether it's now or in the past, or coming up in April, we ask that you take action with what you've learned. And so I thought this question that I'm going to pose as our last one would be a great way to end it. Sure. So this is from Rosalie. I hope it's okay. I use your name. Rosalie says, "Hi, Irshad. I love your book. I discovered it at a time when I needed it most. My copy is full of sticky notes. My question, you recently tweeted about becoming a moral courage mentor. Is there more information available about this yet? Would love to become one. Thanks."
Lovely. Thank you. Yes, I'll briefly explain what a moral courage mentor does. So moral courage is what I teach at Oxford University and at schools throughout this country as well. And moral courage in a divided time means listening instead of labeling. I'm keeping it real simple just because I know we're running out of time. And my organization is now in the process of coming out with an online course for those who wish to become certified moral courage mentors. These are people who will actually help a new generation to engage in conversations that repair divides, and to do so again in ways that are deeply honest, not requiring anybody to compromise the ideals in which they believe. So if you want to become a moral courage mentor, just sign up to my newsletter. You can just go to irshadmanji.com and you'll see the newsletter link in the top right-hand corner. It's in green. And I'll soon be releasing the details. But here's what I want you to know. As I mentioned, I teach at Oxford University. Well, the program in which I teach is something called the Initiative for Global Ethics and Human Rights. And they will be issuing the certificate for moral courage mentors. So you'll actually be earning something from Oxford University. And with that, you'll be part of a global community that can swap notes with each other, can come up with best practices, and really take this teaching to a whole new level. And the final thing I'm going to say, because Beatrice, you said that, we ask people to think about taking action. I mentioned earlier, right, that we have to be intentional about engaging with people who are not part of our immediate world. So what I'm doing in that regard is I'm collaborating with an anti-poverty organization to help ensure that those who are on the ground trying to revitalize their own neighborhoods by busting up gang warfare and getting former gangsters to actually reconcile, I'm going to ensure that they have access to the moral courage training as well. And that if they're interested, they can become certified as moral courage mentors. And that is an extra mile, literally and figuratively, because I want to ensure that this isn't just something for people who have the time to, engage in webinars like this, but who are fighting every day for the survival of their families, of their neighborhoods, and their communities. So I hope that I too will, be living up to the values that I claim to embrace.
Well, thank you so much for your time, Irshad. It was lovely to get to talk to you. It was great to read your book. We read it. Hopefully, if you all who read the book enjoyed this and then enjoyed the conversation, please let us know. We would love to hear your feedback. There were so many thank yous, so many appreciations. There's a side note for your stuff, Irshad. I'll send you an email.
Okay. Okay.
And but thank you all so much for joining us. For those of you who joined, and a special thank you to Irshad. Join us for the 2021 virtual conference on world affairs, which takes place Monday, April 5th through Sunday, April 11th. The speakers are already up on the CWA website, and the CWA does rely on the generosity of people like you to make this event possible. So please consider making a gift to the CWA and go to www.colorado.edu/CWA. And again, just a huge thank you all for joining us, listening to us. And again, I apologize for all the questions we did not get to. But Irshad, do you have a platform where people might be able to engage outside of this?
Absolutely, on social media. And I really do engage, and I ask lots of questions. So please be prepared to engage with me. I'm at Irshad Manji on Twitter and Real Irshad Manji on Instagram. Please do reach out. I'd be happy to hear from you, especially if you have constructive criticisms.
Awesome. Thank you so much.
Great. Thank you, everybody. Good night.
Bye, everybody.